Good morning, everyone, and welcome to some stops along the way. I'm Mark McCord, and welcome to this podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also focusing on their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. Today, we're continuing on with an extremely interesting country, which is Pakistan. This country in South Asia that, as I said in the last episode, to me, having worked there is really an enigma wrapped in a riddle. We've got a lot to cover today to walk through its politics and its economy. So buckle up because this will be a pretty complex episode and one of the possibly a little bit longer episode because we have a lot to cover. When you talk about Pakistan, there are many areas where you can focus. But today I want to pick up on an idea that I introduced during the first episode, and that is the importance of the military in Pakistan's political spectrum. To understand Pakistan's politics, you have to start with the relationship between the civilian government and the military, a relationship that has shaped the country since really its earliest days. As I said in the first episode, Pakistan was born in 1947 with weak civil institutions and strong security anxieties. This came from the trauma of partition, the refugee crisis, and the early conflict with India, which created a political environment where the military quickly became the most organized, disciplined, and trusted institution in the country. Over the decades, Pakistan has experienced multiple military coups, periods of direct military rule, and long stretches of civilian governments operating under military influence, which is really what is occurring today. But the military's role is not just about defense. It has influence in areas such as foreign policy, internal security, economic planning, and even media narratives. Why? The answer is not overly complicated. It's because the military sees itself as the guardian of national stability, especially in a country that has faced wars, insurgencies, and political volatility. Civilian leaders, meanwhile, struggle with fragmented parties, corruption allegations, and short political horizons. The result is a system where the military doesn't always govern directly, but it governs decisively. In other words, in a country where the winds of political change can blow at a moment's notice, the military has provided the stable force, whether directly or indirectly, that has kept the country on course. I want to give you an example of this. During my recent trip to Pakistan, I'd been gone for a number of years. It had been the better part of 15 years since I had been in Pakistan prior to my 2025 trip. And I was very interested at that time, not only in what had changed economically, but what had changed politically during the period that I had been working in other parts of the world. So it just so happened that when I arrived in Pakistan for this trip in 2025, I was met by the representative of an advisor to the prime minister. And on the way to the hotel, the advisor was talking to me about a specific economic issue, the issue of bonded servitude or bonded labor, which I'll talk about later in this episode. which is really what I was there to address, to help the government and to encourage the government to eliminate bonded labor, or at least to enforce the prohibition on bonded labor that had been passed in the 1990s, but never really uh, put in place or codified, enforced by the government. So we're having this conversation, and she brought up to me the opportunity to play golf with what she said was a senior government official. Um, I had some time, and quite frankly, that type of connection was positive to what I was doing because it would give me informal time with a senior member of government to talk about the issue of bonded servitude. So I was very pleased to do this, and I love to play golf as well. So, and the only chance really to play golf at the Islamabad Country Club is by invitation of the government because it is a private club. And so I was very pleased for this invitation. So a couple of days later, she contacted me and said, we'll pick you up at the hotel at 5 a.m. and we'll take you to the country club. So promptly at 5, I was in the lobby of the hotel. Her driver was there, took me directly to the country club. And I was introduced to a government official that was going to be my playing partner for the day. And this representative of the prime minister was playing as well. So we exchanged cordialities and began playing golf. And I began talking about the issue that I was there to address, which was trying to end bonded labor, especially in the brick kiln industry in Pakistan. And he seemed quite interested in it. And we continued to play our round of golf. The more questions that I asked and the more statements I made, I began to realize that this was not just a normal government official, quote unquote normal. That this person that was my playing partner was at a level that everyone deferred to him, whether it was the caddies, whether it was this representative of the prime minister, anyone who saw him on the course, there was an immediate deference, which is not uncommon with government officials, but this seemed to be over and above what I would have expected. And as I began to talk to him about his background, I realized that he was a military man. He was a general. And that not only was he a general, but he was one of the decision makers, in fact, the major decision maker in the Ministry of Interior, which obviously is someone that I needed to be close to in order to address this issue of bonded labor, but was also an example of this shadow government that I talked about yesterday. The Minister of Interior, the civilian Minister of Interior, would have done nothing without consulting this general. Later on that day, we went to the National Investment Promotion Agency of Pakistan. And the head of that agency and his 2 deputies were all, well, 2 of them were generals and 1 of them was a colonel, but they were all in the military. So this dynamic of the military's direct or indirect control shapes everything. It shapes everything that we're going to talk about really in this episode. from Kashmir to nuclear policy to the economy. The description of Pakistan's military as a shadow government is not only common in academic and policy circles, it's broadly supported by decades of political history and contemporary analysis. Multiple authoritative sources describe the military as the most powerful political actor in the economy, even during periods of civilian rule. Several analyses note that military has directly ruled Pakistan for more than 3 decades and continues to exert influence from the sidelines, even when not formally in power. One 2024 review describes the military as the most formidable political player in Pakistan, with the capacity to overshadow civilian institutions even while remaining in the barracks. And certainly my interaction during my most recent trip to Pakistan supports this. My first trip to Pakistan was during the Musharraf government, which was a military government. The government in Pakistan now is a civilian government, but still very much controlled by the military. Another 2024 analysis calls the military's influence an invisible hand, shaping the governance, security, and economic decisions behind the scenes. A 2025 academic review goes further, describing Pakistan's military intelligence establishment as deep state that guides national decisions from hidden positions. Taken together, these sources support the conclusion that yes, the military functions as a shadow government, even if the degree of visibility varies over time. So why did the military in Pakistan become so powerful? Well, there are several structural factors that have led to this. First of all, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, was the weak civilian institutions that really link all the way back to 1947 to the petition. Pakistan began its life with very fragile institutions, while the military inherited strong organizational capacity, and the imbalance persists even to this day. Also, Pakistan's under numerous national security threats. They have persistent tensions with India, especially over Kashmir, and that's elevated the military's role as the guardian of national survival. Then, of course, there's the military and bureaucratic alliance. There's a long-standing partnership in Pakistan between the military and civilian bureaucracy, and that's reinforced military dominance in governance. Another reason is public trust and political fragmentation. The government, or the people rather, in Pakistan support and trust the military. Civilian governments often struggle with instability, corruption, short tenures, and it makes it very difficult for the average population to trust governments that come in and out of power and have all types of political machinations. But one stabilizing force, a force on which they've always depended to provide stability in the country and to protect the national interest, is the military. Now, certainly, the military has had its periods of brutal crackdowns, and there are those in the country that are very wary of the military. But the fact is, the military has been that stabilizing force since the beginning, since the petition in 1947. So, how does the military influence public policy? Well, it does so in many ways. And even when not ruling directly, the military shapes Pakistan's policies over several key domains. First of all, the most obvious is foreign policy and national security. This is the area where the military has the greatest influence because it is seen as the protector of the country, especially when it comes to the conflict with India over Kashmir, its role in being a liaison with the United States and its allies during the Afghan war, and in its dealings with the United States. It also exerts a great deal of influence in domestic politics and elections. The military in Pakistan has repeatedly intervened in the political process. There were coups in 1958, 1977, and 1999. 1999, by the way, is when General Musharraf came to power. We'll talk about Musharraf in just a few minutes. There were also caretaker governments that were influenced by military preferences. And of course, as I said before, behind the scenes involvement in party formation, judicial processes, and media narratives. So truly, if the military is not overtly governing Pakistan, it certainly is indirectly. It is that shadow government that I talked about that continues to influence the country. The military also has a very large role in economic policy. While this is not traditionally an economic institution, the Pakistan military has increasingly influenced economic decision making. In fact, a 2024 analysis that I reviewed prior to this podcast highlights military participation in financial councils, involvement in crisis management, and influence over economic reforms during Pakistan's recent economic turmoil. The military also controls a vast network of business conglomerates, land holdings, foundations, welfare organizations, which shape the economic policy and resource allocation in the country. I encountered this during my last trip when I visited a number of government institutions that were philanthropic and educational oriented institutions, all of which were headed by either military or former military officers. There's virtually no area of Pakistan society, whether it's business, civil society, or government, where you will not see the military's overt or covert integration. The military, of course, has taken a key role in internal security and counterterrorism. The military has led major internal security operations, especially in the former tribal areas. Civilian authorities often defer their military judgment and internal security strategy to the military, as they are the professionals in this area. It's not surprising that the military would be involved in internal security and counterterrorism. But some of these other areas, like the economy, like media and information policy, for instance, are typically not areas where the military in other countries is involved, but certainly they are in Pakistan. From the standpoint of media and information, for instance, the military is heavily involved in media narratives, censorship, the boundaries of acceptable political discourse. Its influence shapes public opinion and political outcomes. So, what's the conclusion? You really have a state within a state in Pakistan. The military is not merely an institution, it's a central political actor. It's governed directly for long periods and governs indirectly during civilian rule. It shapes foreign policy, it shapes security strategy, economic decisions, political processes. And in that case, it really is a shadow government. I personally don't like the term deep state. I think it's too hard to define, and I think that in many cases, deep state is more of a theatrical term. But I think shadow government does apply to the inner workings of Pakistan and the involvement of the military in Pakistan. However, we need to understand the military's dominance is not absolute. Civilian governments do exercise authority in Pakistan, but it's structural, enduring, and deeply embedded in Pakistan's political system, meaning the military is very much at the core of what happens. But it would be wrong of me to say that nothing will happen in Pakistan without the military being involved. It does have a civilian government. That civilian government does have the authority to act. However, in the past, and we're using history as a reflection here, in the past, when civilian governments have disagreed with the military, or their policies have run counter to policies that the military supported, and a power struggle ensued, at least historically, the military has always prevailed over the civilian government. It's also very difficult to talk about the role of the military in Pakistan without talking about Kashmir. If the civilian military balance in Pakistan is the country's internal fault line, Kashmir is its external one. The Kashmir dispute dates back to 1947, when the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is majority Muslim, was ruled by a Hindu monarch. It became the central flashpoint of partition, with India and Pakistan both wanting this territory and both fighting the first war over it within months of independence. Since then, Kashmir has remained divided, heavily militarized, emotionally charged, and politically unresolved. So why is this remote mountainous area in Pakistan so important to both the Indians and the Pakistanis? There are several reasons. First, Kashmir is an unfinished business of partition. We need to understand that when British India was divided in 1947, as I said, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, with a majority Muslim population, was ruled by a Hindu, and therefore it became an unresolved question. Once partition happened, India and Pakistan both claimed it immediately, and a war broke out within the first few months. The origin story of how this all happened still shapes the dispute today. Pakistan sees Kashmir as the natural extension of its identity and as a homeland for South Asia's Muslims. India sees Kashmir as the foundational moment providing its secular, multi-religious character. This framing is echoed in contemporary analysis, which notes that Kashmir has outlasted empires, it's ignited wars, and drawn the world to the brink of nuclear confrontation. The second reason that Kashmir is so important to both India and Pakistan is that it's a symbol of national identity. For Pakistan, Kashmir is tied to the idea that Muslim-majority regions should have joined Pakistan after the partition. It's emotionally and ideologically central to the country's founding narrative. Remember, one of the reasons a partition happened is to provide the vast Hindu population in India with its territory, but also to provide Pakistan as a traditional home for South Asia's Muslim population. But here you had Kashmir, who was predominantly Muslim population, but ruled by the Hindus, that is important to both sides. And this has led to the conflict. For India, Kashmir is proof that a Muslim-majority region can thrive inside a secular, pluralistic republic. Losing it would undermine that vision. This identity dimension is why the dispute remains so charged, because it's not just about land, it's about legitimacy. A third reason that Kashmir is important to both the Indians and the Pakistanis is that it is a strategic and military flashpoint. And this comes really from where Kashmir is located. Kashmir sits at the northern edge of the subcontinent, touching India, Pakistan, and China. And so control of that region affects access to mountain passes, control of high altitude borders, military positioning along the line of control, and balance of power in South Asia. The region has triggered multiple wars and countless skirmishes. Recent reporting highlights how quickly the crisis can escalate, with missile and drone exchanges bringing two nuclear-armed states of India and Pakistan to the brink of war on many occasions. And it can happen virtually overnight. A fourth reason that Kashmir is important to both India and Pakistan is that it's a nuclear flashpoint. Both India and Pakistan possess nuclear weapons, and Kashmir is the most likely trigger for a nuclear confrontation. The conflict has already escalated into 3 full wars and several near wars. The Global Conflict Tracker notes that Kashmir remains one of the world's most dangerous conflict zones, with frequent clashes along the line of control. This is why global powers monitor the region so closely. This is not just an India-Pakistan issue any longer. This is a global issue, especially when it involves 2 nuclear powers who, if they enter into a conflict with each other, their actions could have severe repercussions throughout South Asia, all of Asia, and really all of the world. A fifth reason that Kashmir is so important to both India and Pakistan is that it has deep cultural, emotional, and historical resonance. We need to understand that Kashmir is not just geopolitical space. It's a place of extraordinarily beautiful landscape, culture, and history. It's been romanticized in poetry, art, and memory for centuries. For many Pakistanis and Indians, Kashmir is woven into national imagination. That emotional weight makes compromise politically difficult. So, who's at the center of this conflict besides these 2 countries? Well, when governments are in conflict with each other, it's always the people who are at the center. While India and Pakistan frame Kashmir in national terms, the people of Kashmir have their own identities, aspirations, and grievances. The region's endured militarization, insurgency, political repression, and cycles of violence. It's always the people that get caught in the pincers. Government officials do what government officials do. It's the people that don't have the power, who are simply citizens trying to live their lives, that get caught up in the roots of the conflict and the political vacuum that's occurred with this, and really conflicts all over the world. As I said, Kashmir is no longer just, and really never was, just an issue between India and Pakistan. It's much wider than that. And now it's entangled China as well. The reason is that China controls Aksai Chin and the Shagtam Valley, parts of the broader Kashmir region, adding a third nuclear armed state to the equation. The Kashmir conflict is therefore not only bilateral, but triangular. This integration of China into the conflict has also created a lot of geopolitical positioning by India and Pakistan to court China, to try to ensure that China is, quote unquote, on their side on the Kashmir issue. So here you have three nuclear states who want to claim all or a portion of the same mountainous, remote territory for a variety of different reasons. A lot of news reports would make you think that it's simply security oriented. It's not. As we've just talked about, there are many reasons why both India and Pakistan, and to a lesser degree China, want to control Kashmir. So, in summary, Kashmir is important to India and Pakistan because it represents their identity, legitimacy, security, and history, and because it remains the most volatile fault line between these two nuclear armed rivals. For Pakistan's military, Kashmir is central to its narrative of national defense. For Pakistan civilians, its diplomatic and political challenge has no easy solution. For the people of Kashmir, it is lived reality of conflict. They deal with uncertainty, they deal with loss on a daily basis. So, as I said, it's not just a territorial dispute. It's a story of identity, trauma, and competing national visions, and it remains one of the major flashpoints of the world. So while Kashmir has been a central issue that's entangled Pakistan's geopolitical trajectory for many years, to really understand the nature of Pakistan's political environment, you have to look at its leaders. In 1947, when the petition occurred, Pakistan's first leader, its first prime minister, was Liaquat Ali Khan. He brought at that time stability and vision, but he was assassinated in 1951, and that left a vacuum in which a great deal of instability occurred. Over the next decade, Pakistan saw political infighting, weak civilian governments, and a growing reliance on military and bureaucracy. By 1958, the military had had enough, and they stepped in. And that's when Pakistan entered its first era of military rule. Ayub Khan, the first military president, brought economic growth and modernization, but also centralized power and deepened inequality. His fall in 1969 set the stage for the rise of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, a charismatic civilian leader who rebuilt national confidence after the 1971 war and the loss of East Pakistan. Bhutto gave Pakistan its first constitution in 1973, and it's still the backbone of the state to this day. But his authoritarian tendencies and political repression created the conditions for another coup. In 1977, that coup occurred, with General Zia-ul-Haq taking power. Zia's rule reshaped Pakistan more than any leader before him, even more so than the iconic Bhutto. Islamization, that's a tough word to say. The Afghan jihad, the rise of militant networks, and the deepening of military's role in politics all occurred under Zia's rule. By the time Zia died in 1988, Pakistan had changed forever. In the 1990s, there was a decade of democratic churn. There were 4 elected governments during the 1990s, and none of them were stable. Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif alternated in power, each dismissed before completing a term. Both leaders brought moments of progress, for sure, with economic liberalization, press freedoms, and infrastructure development, but both struggled with corruption allegations, political polarization, in constant tension with the military. The decade ended with the Kargil conflict in 1999, a limited war in Kashmir that damaged Pakistan's international standing and shattered the trust between the civilian government and the military. And that led to, guess what? Another coup. And this is where the curtain raises on General Pervez Musharraf, who took control of Pakistan on October 12, 1999. As I said, my first work in Pakistan was during General Musharraf's presidency. Musharraf overthrew Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in a bloodless coup. He appeared on television in uniform, calm and confident, promising to save Pakistan from corruption, mismanagement, and political chaos. For many Pakistanis who were by this time extremely weary of instability, Musharraf's arrival felt like a reset. He became chief executive, then president, while retaining his role as army chief. And for nearly a decade, he shaped Pakistan more than any other figure. In a moment, we're going to break down his legacy. But before we do that, I want to go back to this notion of Musharraf's arrival feeling like a reset because the Pakistanis were wary of instability. After the period of the civil war in Afghanistan, after the Russian war, when the Mujahideen turned on each other and began the civil war, there was a huge period of instability there, almost lawlessness in Afghanistan. And the rise of the Taliban was directly proportional to the fact that the people wanted stability. And because they wanted stability, they were willing to accept a government that provided that, even if it was a government that ultimately was repressive and that was considered to be virtually a rogue government around the world. This is a similar mindset that led to Pervez Musharraf's ascension to the presidency in Pakistan. The people were fed up with a series of governments that had been corrupt, that had not really accomplished the economic goals that needed to be accomplished, and hadn't dealt with poverty, that had entered in some embarrassing political and international issues in Kashmir. They wanted a strong man, and they got one in Musharraf. Even so, Musharraf's early years were marked by confidence, clarity, and a sense of direction. He increased economic growth and liberalization. Pakistan's economy grew rapidly in the early 2000s. Foreign investment surged. Telecom and banking sectors modernized, and a new middle class emerged. For a time, Pakistan felt open, dynamic, and globally connected. He also liberalized the media. One of Musharraf's most surprising reforms was allowing private television channels. This transformed Pakistan's media landscape, creating space for debate, satire, and political commentary. Ironically, the media he empowered later became one of his biggest critics. He also increased the representation of women. General Musharraf expanded women's seats in parliament and supported legal reforms that strengthened women's rights. He was a champion of local government reform. His 2001 devolution plan created elected local councils, giving citizens more direct governance. One of his major successes was in counterterrorism cooperation after 9/11. After the attacks on the United States, Musharraf aligned Pakistan with Washington. Pakistan became a frontline state in the war on terror. Al-Qaeda networks were disrupted, billions in aid flowed into Pakistan from not just the United States, but its allies around the world. For a moment, Pakistan was central to global strategy, and Musharraf was seen as indispensable. But along with all of those successes, there was a negative side to Musharraf's legacy. He was a man of contradictions. And these contradictions developed, I would say, what you could term as long-term consequences for Pakistan. One of those was democratic erosion. Musharraf suspended the constitution, dismissed judges, manipulated elections. His rule weakened democratic norms and strengthened the military's political role. Why? Because he, at least indirectly, advocated martial law. In order to secure the country and to fight terrorism, the military has to be in charge. And on its face, this is anti-democratic. And so it's natural that democratic reforms were eroded during his tenure. There was also a great rise of militancy in tribal areas during his presidency. While fighting al-Qaeda, Pakistan saw the rise of the Pakistani Taliban, which was called the TTP. Military operations displaced millions of people. The tribal area destabilized and extremism spread. At the time that I traveled to the tribal area, it was a supremely dangerous place that I will tell you right now I never should have been. I'm glad that I went because I got to see what was really happening in that area. But it was lawless. It was out of control. And this lawlessness, this militancy in the tribal areas became one of the most damaging legacies of his era. Musharraf's rule was also marked with an over-reliance on the United States. Pakistan became dependent on U.S. aid. And because of this, domestic backlash grew. The alliance between Pakistan and the United States created internal fractures that still shape its politics today. Remember, at its very roots, Pakistan is a Muslim country and a very conservative Muslim country. There is a Christian population in Afghanistan, or in Pakistan rather, but it's a minority. The great majority are Muslim. And the Taliban had a great deal of support, especially in the western part of Pakistan, in the tribal areas especially. And so this alliance with the United States created severe internal fissures. The Musharraf regime was also very heavily tied to political engineering. Musharraf created PMLQ, the so-called King's Party. He used intelligence agencies to shape political outcomes. This undermined long-term political development. And even though there were a lot of economic gains during Musharraf's rule, they didn't last. The growth was real, don't get me wrong about that, but it was fragile and it was somewhat artificial because it depended on foreign aid, debt, and global conditions. By 2008, toward the end of Musharraf's reign, Pakistan faced inflation, energy shortage, and fiscal stress. So this boom, if you will, in Pakistan's economy tended to be, if I can use the analogy, a lot more icing than cake. Musharraf resigned in 2008 under pressure from the judiciary, the opposition, and the public. And his departure opened the door for a new democratic era, but it didn't get rid of the old tensions that were still in place. Civilian governments returned, but the military's influence persisted. The economy struggled. Militancy continued. Political polarization deepened. Pakistan today is shaped by all the eras we've discussed, but especially by the Musharraf decade. with its mixed modernization, repression, opportunity, and instability. So, Pakistan's story is far from linear. It's built on hope and disappointment, military intervention, progress, and setbacks. And Musharraf sits at the center of that story. He was a modernizer and a military ruler, a reformer and a disruptor, a partner to the West and a polarizing figure at home. His legacy is complicated, but it's impossible to understand Pakistan without understanding the decade that it was ruled by Pervez Musharraf, which is why I took some time in this episode to walk through that. Now, as I said before, Pakistan is, along with India, are both nuclear countries. After India tested its first nuclear device in 1974, Pakistan's leadership, its civilian and military, concluded that nuclear weapons were essential for national survival. After all, its biggest neighbor and its biggest enemy had nuclear weapons. China has them, and India has them. So the region entered a new era, one where two rivals, Pakistan and India, now possessed the ultimate deterrent. For Pakistan, nuclear weapons serve several purposes. Deterrence, first and foremost, against the larger conventional Indian military, but also it served as national pride for technological achievement and strategic leverage in international diplomacy. Pakistan's doctrine emphasizes full spectrum deterrence, the idea that nuclear weapons must deter threats at every level, from conventional war to limited conflict. But nuclear capability also brings challenges, concerns about proliferation, the risk of miscalculation, and the burden of maintaining a secure arsenal in a very volatile region. The nuclear program is one of the clearest examples of how Pakistan's security anxieties shape its national priorities, often at the expense of economic development. Musharraf's government especially was heavily focused on its nuclear positioning, if you will, as a foundational stone to the stability of not only the country's security, but the country's governance. As I said, Pakistan's economy under Musharraf grew exponentially. It did under some of the other rulers as well. But the economic reforms tended not to take. If you look, though, on paper, Pakistan has some extremely good economic advantages. It has a young population. It has a strategic location along the Silk Road. It has massive agriculture capacity. It's got a growing tech sector. But on the other side, it also has high debt, a dependence on external financing, energy shortages, political instability, and a narrow tax base. My travel to Pakistan really reinforced in me how many of these economic reforms, from the time that I worked there 15 to 20 years ago until I returned in 2025, had unraveled, especially in terms of things like the brick kiln sector and the agriculture sector, which continue to operate at a low level of industrial capacity, a low level of technological capacity, minimal modernization, etc. As I said, the military's influence plays a role in the economy as well. Defense spending is high, and this leaves very few resources for things like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Pakistan's turned repeatedly to international lenders for support, including the International Monetary Fund, and this brings short-term relief but long-term constraints. And yet the country is not without resilience. Remittances from overseas Pakistanis are strong. Entrepreneurship is rising. And despite political turbulence, the private sector continues to adapt. When you hear, though, about a country that has an economy that's largely driven by remittances, this is an example or an indicator of something that's wrong in the economy. Because economies should be driven from within, not from without. And remittances mean that Pakistanis leave the country, they work somewhere else, and they send money back to the country, to their families. This is the reverse of what should happen in a growing economy, because jobs and economic opportunities should be available for people in the country where they don't have to leave and send back remittances. Even with all this, Pakistan's economy is not collapsing, but it is under strain, and the future depends on stability, reform, and the ability to balance security with development. So when you put the pieces together, the civilian military dynamics, Kashmir, nuclear strategy, the economy, you see a country shaped by interlocking pressures. The military's influence is reinforced by security threats. Security threats are reinforced by unresolved disputes. Unresolved disputes justify nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence and security spending strain the economy. Economic strain weakens civilian institutions. Weak civilian institutions reinforce military influence, and so the cycle goes on. It's not inevitable, but it is deeply rooted. And yet, Pakistan is not defined solely by its challenges. It's defined by its people. They're resilient, creative, capable of navigating complexity with humor and grace. I just love the Pakistani people so much, which is why it has really broken my heart to see the lack of progress, especially on the economic side of the equation, during my work in Pakistan, both in the early 2000s and then again most recently. And of course, that's indelibly linked to governance, to politics. You can't have one without the other. And one of the examples of this challenge on the economic side is this role that I alluded to earlier of bonded labor. And I want to interject bonded labor into this economic discussion because I think it's important for you to know what bonded labor really is and why it is an example of what is wrong in Pakistan's economy. Some have called bonded labor slavery. It's really not slavery. There's certainly an indelible link there, but bonded labor is really debt bondage. It's a system where a worker becomes trapped in a cycle of debt to an employer or a landlord. The debt's often small at the beginning, but interest, deductions, and manipulation make it impossible to repay. In the brick kiln industry, for example, I traveled to a number of brick kilns in Pakistan to make the case that bonded laborers should be freed. And in some cases, to actually, I was working with an organization that was actually paying bonded labor, the debt of bonded laborers, and freeing them from bonded servitude and providing them other opportunities in the economy. But in talking to some of these people, they had been in bonded labor for multi-generations. I talked to one man whose grandfather had entered into a small debt that he never could repay. And so when he died, that debt reverted to his father, who worked in the brick kilns along with the whole family until he died. And then the debt still wasn't paid, and it reverted to the son that I was talking to. 3 generations of a family over a very small debt that were trapped as bonded laborers doing backbreaking work in the brick kilns, making bricks by hand, not just the adults, but everyone down to the smallest child, living in deplorable conditions. In many cases, suffering abuse, ridicule, and manipulation over small debts that they can never pay. But it wasn't just bonded labor is not just germane to brick kilns. You can find bonded labor in Pakistan in agriculture as well, in carpet weaving, in stone quarries, in domestic work. And as I alluded to before, bonded labor is technically illegal under Pakistani law, but it persists because of weak enforcement and entrenched power structures that I talked about earlier. Bonded labor in Pakistan didn't appear suddenly. It grew out of several long-standing systems. One was the colonial era land and revenue structures. Under British rule, large landlords, who were called zamindars, were empowered to collect taxes and control agricultural labor. This created a hierarchy where peasants depended on landlords for things like land, credit, protection, and therefore debt became a tool of control. And of course, similar to India, though not as pronounced, is a caste system and occupational hierarchies. In parts of Pakistan, especially rural Sindh and southern Punjab provinces, caste-like social structures still influence labor relations. Lower status groups often have limited mobility and rely on landlords for survival. There's also a lack of formal banking in rural areas. So for decades, poor families have had no access to banks or credit. Landlords then became lenders of last resort. And how did these people get in bonded labor to begin with? Well, they borrowed money for small things like a wedding or a funeral or medical treatment or seeds or fertilizer. And even these small loans would trap a family, as I said before, for generations. Partition and displacement also played a role in bonded labor. After 1947, massive population movements disrupted rural economies. Many landless families became even more vulnerable to exploitative labor arrangements. So, how does bonded labor work in practice? It's deceptively simple. A worker takes a loan called an advance, or the Pakistanis call it a peshki. The employer deducts the repayment from their wages. The employer controls the accounting. Interest and fees accumulate at rates that are both astronomical and that are even unknown to those who borrowed the money. That makes the debt grow instead of shrinking. The worker cannot leave until the debt's paid. And as I said before, the debt does not end with the death of the person who borrowed the money. It's inherited by their families, In brick kilns, for instance, entire families, including children, work to meet daily quotas. In agriculture, families live on the landlord's land and depend on him for food, shelter, and security. Like I said, it's not slavery in the legal sense, but it functions like it. So if there was this law in the 1990s that outlawed bonded labor, why does it still exist? Well, the reason it still exists is because of all of the things we've already discussed in this episode. Weak institutions, deep-seated cultural biases, and political control. Look at it this way. Landlords are very powerful. In many rural districts, landlords hold political office, political influence, and economic control. And even if a labor law exists, they can block that law. In many cases in Afghanistan, the provinces have even more power in enforcing legislation than the federal government has. There's also weak labor inspection. Pakistan's labor inspectorates are underfunded and often even absent in rural areas. One of the most basic reasons why bonded labor still exists is that when a family has no savings, no land, and no access to credit, a loan from a landowner or kiln owner becomes their only option. And it's employment. I was told by a politician or a government official in Pakistan, well, we appreciate what you're trying to do in providing freedom and opportunities for these bonded laborers, but where are they supposed to go to work? What jobs are they supposed to take? This is a part of the economy. The informal sector in Pakistan is huge. And this is a part of the economy, but it's also control. As I said, most of Pakistan's labor market is undocumented. So just educating, providing health care, providing opportunities for those coming out of bonded labor would be an astronomical task for the government and one that they haven't been willing to take on. But social norms play into it as well. I was told by multiple government officials that this is just the way things are. It's not a violation, it's just reality. As I said, in 1992, Pakistan formally abolished bonded labor. It also developed a national policy and action plan for abolition of bonded labor in 2001. It also has provincial laws that are against bonded labor. So on paper, these laws abolish bonded labor, they cancel all debts, they criminalize employers, and they free workers. But the enforcement isn't there and likely will never be there in any consistent manner. This creates child labor issues. It creates urban migration. It creates a number of social ills, and it erodes economic growth overall in Pakistan. There are reform efforts, of course. There are NGOs that run shelters and legal aid programs. There are some provinces that have introduced biometric wage systems for kiln and agriculture bonded laborers. Courts occasionally intervene to free entire families. There's media coverage around the world now on this issue. But still, it persists. And the reason is because it's not just a labor issue. It's a real window into rural inequality, political patronage, the limits of state capacity, resilience of feudal structures, and the vulnerability of the poor, all of which are endemic to the petition. They go all the way back to 1947, which has been the theme of this episode. So bonded labor is just an example of an institution that has proliferated because of multiple factors that we've talked about in this episode. So as I said, Pakistan's a country of contradictions. Powerful and vulnerable, stable and fragile, proud and pressured. Its politics cannot be understood without its military. Its military cannot be understood without Kashmir. Kashmir cannot be understood without history. And none of it can be understood without looking at the economic realities that shape daily life. But beneath all of this nation, Pakistan is still searching for a balance. It's still searching for that middle ground between security, democracy, identity, and pragmatism, past and future. I know this has been a longer episode, but I think it's been an important one, and I hope that you've gained some real insight into Pakistan through the lens of my work there, but also through its history, its culture, and its geopolitics. We will jump into a new country in the very near future on the podcast. So join us for the next episode next Monday on some stops along the way. Have a great week.